He has thrown down the rulers from their thrones, but lifted up the lowly. May 20th, 2025. In my work as a music education philosopher, I've written critically of educational institutions in general, as well as music education systems in specific. I have argued that conceiving of music as a fixed transcendental is unworkable for music teachers and limiting for philosophers, as well as being anti-Trinitarian, where the transcendent core of reality, which leaves its fingerprint, to use Bonaventure's idea, on every molecule of the universe is not immovable, but rather is a relationship. Love is expressed by movement. Without movement, there is no love. This is why, if there were no Trinitarian ideas in Scripture or in the theology of the early Christian church fathers, the most Platonist philosophers would need to posit one to admit any movement in the universe. The fingerprint of movement is everywhere in a special way. The fingerprint of movement is the music as an expression of one being to another, a songbird teaching expressive melodies to her young, a whale song becoming popular across pods in the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a congregation soaring on eagle's wings in resonated communion with one another and God. Educational institutions have long been criticized in the Christian tradition, especially by Ivan Illich, the Catholic Monsignor and author of the 1960s classic Deschooling Society. Curricula and educational technologies, the structures of school buildings, and the regimenting of each child's time, behavioral management systems, and standardized testing each form the rituals of modernity that we subject our children to in their formation to become priests and priestesses of consumerism. These two criticisms have come easy to me as a philosopher. However, my thinking has been elevated by the Catholic intellectual tradition, and I have been unwilling to criticize the Catholic Church. The Church has been like a second wife to me, and one doesn't criticize one's wife in public. But all wives have proverbial warts. My wife doesn't have any actual warts. Should I be cautious in criticizing the Catholic Church, which provided so many thinkers from Augustine to Leo, Bonaventure to Leonardo Boff, Hildegard to Teilhard, and Thomas Merton to Dorothy Day? Many of these Christians, as authors, have been more critical of the Church than I have been. I am, however, cautious. That cautiousness arises from growing up Catholic and poor in a rural town that had many anti-Catholics. Growing up and exploring other religions with their explicit anti-Catholicism, and living now in a nation with much nearly invisible but persistent anti-Catholic words, politics, and actions. The U.S. might not today explicitly identify itself as WASP, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, but it does inexplicitly still identify itself as such. Catholics, even after two presidents and after 2/3 of the Supreme Court, feel in many ways like outsiders in America. Additional cautions arise out of the nonsensical but commonplace trio of tropes against the Catholic Church: the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and Galileo's persecution. Any deep study of the Crusades will reveal that they were not the colonial expansion as which they are described. Rather, they were a series of medieval political and military conflicts that are entirely pre-colonial. Pope Urban II in 1095 called for the First Inquisition, First Crusade. Fix that. But popes were not the powerful figures they became after Vatican I in 1869. During the First Crusade, which was by the request of the Byzantine Empire against the expansionist Seljuk Turks, was meant to protect the sacred sites for pilgrimage, not to create a papal colony in Jerusalem. Godfrey of Bouillon was elected advocate of the Holy Sepulchre because he had the charisma and power to recall the Crusaders that had already begun returning home to Europe to protect Jerusalem from the Fatmid army that was attacking in 1099. The fact that the Crusaders were returning home after securing the Holy Sepulchre for pilgrimage contradicts the idea that the First Crusade was designed as colonial expansion. Rather, the Crusades were sadly typical. Brutally violent series of events with moments of beauty and ugliness on all sides of the conflict. Human, all too human, but not room for specific criticism of the Catholic Church. In contrast, the Spanish Inquisition was a Renaissance era, started in 1478, institution that combined religious and secular aims. The mythology around the Inquisition, as I'll refer to the Spanish Inquisition in specific, arose in the 19th century with the popular fundamentalist writings of Henry Lea and G. Coulton, who wrote with the then open anti-Catholic bias. Most contemporary folk don't even realize their thoughts on the Inquisition were molded in 19th century anti-Catholic writings. The Inquisition had Protestant equivalents in the witch hunts. Both were used in the transition from feudal to capitalist societies to dispossess small landowners of their property. This was outlined by Silvia Federici in her book, Caliban and the Witch, specifically in relation to the Protestant witch hunts of the era. There is no reason to believe the Inquisition, which occurred in the same era and dispossessed accused people of their property, had a different motivating foundation. It seems likely that folk using the Inquisition as an argument against Catholicism either could care less about Protestant witch hunts or are not aware of the apparent material root of land possession in this pre-early capitalistic period. Just as with the Crusades, criticism of the Inquisition does not appear as a criticism of the Catholic Church in specific, but is a product of an unjust movement like the unjust land disposition movements today. The third Catholic trope is the persecution of Galileo. I've also always wondered why the Catholic Church, which had for a century before Galileo accepted Copernicus' heliocentric theory, which Martin Luther had condemned but rejected Galileo's heliocentric theory. For Catholic intellectuals, the Galileo persecution demonstrates how anti-science Catholics are. At the time of Galileo's scholarship, heliocentric theory was not proven, and most scientists argued for a geocentric theory. When Galileo met with Pope Urban VII, he received permission to publish his ideas as a dialogue. In response to the permission granted, Galileo's dialogue on the two world systems presents the holder of the geocentric theory as Simplicio, mocking his longtime supporters, the Jesuits, who had produced the most astronomers in Galileo's century. Galileo was put on trial. Treated very well, and torture was not used. Galileo's writings were condemned in a tribunal, though no infallible doctrine was outlined. Galileo was indeed wrong about some of the points on which he was condemned, such as his assertion that the sun was at the center of the universe, and not merely our solar system. Like the first two of the commonplace trio of tropes, this event reads like 17th century politics, than an argument against the Catholic Church. Despite this, every Catholic child grows up hearing, as proven fact, these proof against the Catholic Church. Despite this, there are areas where criticism is actually warranted, such as its handling of the clergy sex abuse cases. Further criticisms may be laid when the Catholic Church exclaims greater condemnation of communists than of fascists, towards anti-racist than pro-life politicians, or of trans folk than avaricious billionaires. But I am not the person who will develop these criticisms. The Catholic intellectual tradition has offered me, personally, far too much. It offers a language through which to examine, criticize, comprehend, and change the world, and a hope for an eschatology, a Tao that is salvific, a perspective with a expectant referent to an end. Tav is the final letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is, for Christians, an orientation to Christ's saving cross. However sideways the world turns, that Tau endures to advise hope, as it does to countless poor folk across the globe. And this hope is principally, when it seems most irrational to have hope, vital. It gives life to the hopeless and inspires actions that have long proven futile, but which, at times generations later, transformative for humanity. The Catholic intellectual tradition, for me, is a language through which I can help reduce rulers and elevate the lowly.